This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Today, our thoughtful bold leader joins us from Ontario in Canada. He is a prominent human rights lawyer, born and raised in South Africa, and was a high-profile player in the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa. At the tender age of 28, he took on his first big murder trial, defending the Sharpeville Six, who were wrongfully prosecuted and sentenced to death for a crime they did not commit. After he was detained without charge, arrested, tortured, placed in solitary confinement by the South African government, the Canadian government helped him and his family move abroad to Canada. In Canada, his career continues to fly. The Minister of Justice and Attorney General appointed him to work on reconciliation with the Indigenous people of Canada. He trains all federal public prosecutors on the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system. In 2023, he was the proud recipient of the Ontario Law Society's Human Rights Award. The same year, he received the Pioneer Award from the South Asian Bar of North America. And in 2022, he received the Diversity Award from the South Asian Bar of Toronto. He is a published author of the riveting book, The Sharpeville Six. His book has been turned into a long, full-length feature movie soon to be released, which tells the story of his personal journey and his family's bravery. Stay tuned as he shares more with us about his fearless fight for justice in the South African trial that shocked the world, his personal plight, the torture, the detention, the solitary confinement, and his family's bravery, and how he galvanized a global movement to apply political pressure on the South African apartheid government. We warmly welcome my dear friend and a fearless champion of justice, Prakash Diar, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Prakash, my friend, it's always wonderful to connect with you. Thank you for joining us, not only for this conversation, but for being part of this bigger message and movement.
Oh, thank you, and you're too kind.
And I would love to begin with congratulations. The Law Society of Ontario awarded you the 2023 Human Rights Award in Canada. And it's such a wonderful acknowledgement of a long career. And to quote the Law Society, your inspiring career reflects the ideals of the law profession. So I would love to begin with, what does that award mean to you?
Thank you so much for bringing attention to that, Anne. In retrospect, I think, the award means a lot. Not just to me personally. I mean, when I was doing all my legal work and fighting for the true cause of justice for the underdog always, I wasn't thinking of, one day I may be recognized and I may be selected for an award. That was never on the cards. But it's a good feeling to know that you are being recognized for, the decades of work that you've put into. But I think more significant than that for me, not only for me personally, but I think it gives other people who look at this some inspiration.
Yeah.
To say, we know this guy, he came from humble beginnings from South Africa, he went to a foreign country, had to requalify, and he did well. So it's so inspirational to others and younger ones that I think that is more important to me than me being recognized as such.
When they made the point that the award has been granted based on your inspiring career that represents the highest ideals of the law profession, what do you think those highest ideals?
I think they took my career in totality, because this award recognizes your work in Canada primarily, but also not only in Ontario, but nationally and internationally.
Yeah.
And so I think, I did the best for my clients without fear, to my own personal safety. And doing the best for my clients, making certain that I left no stone unturned for my clients, at great sacrifice to myself and my family. And I can give you, we can go into that if you wish, but I think they recognize that in the pursuit of justice, in spite of me having been detained and kept in solitary confinement in South Africa under the state of emergency in the mid-80s, they could not dissuade me from continuing the fight for my clients and for justice until such time that my life was threatened and I had no alternative but to leave the country. So I think they're taking that into account. And then I think they also took into account, I don't know for certain, of course, it's just my assumption, that, I took on some of the biggest cases, precedent-setting cases here in Canada, where I was the lead counsel in which I challenged the government of Canada of discrimination against racial minorities from moving into senior management positions in the federal public service. And that was not easy. It was a very lengthy trial. And we got a wonderful decision confirming what we had alleged. And I think also substantively, my work on Indigenous rights over the last 2 decades, I think was looked at. The Indian residential schools, which is a very sad chapter of Canadian history. So I went into that, and I worked very closely on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And presently, I'm also sharing some knowledge and information and teachings to federal prosecutors in attacking the systemic racism and the overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black peoples in the Canadian criminal legal system. So I think that was a totality of a recognition of my work. But I must say again, I never in my wildest imagination thought that, one day I'd be recognized for that.
Well, you've done remarkable work, Prakash. And, I think you joined the Department of Justice in Canada in 2000. And I think it was in 2017 that you were asked by the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada to help them in terms of dealing with the issues of systemic racism and prejudice against, looking at ways to find reconciliation with Indigenous people.
There's a funny story to that, actually, if I may just mention that. In 2017, I had an assignment to South Africa with a NGO, a non-governmental organization, Lawyers for Human Rights. And I was there on an assignment for 3 months with Lawyers for Human Rights in Johannesburg. And the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada came to visit South Africa to look at the question of reconciliation and the truth and reconciliation, how the South Africans had dealt with it. And so I hooked up with her, and she took a liking to me, and she asked me to join her in this whole quest for reconciliation. So that's how it actually happened. So there's a story behind that, going
That's
back to
wonderful.
South
And
Africa.
that's the Minister of Justice you're talking about.
Yes, yes. And that time it was Minister Justice Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was our first and ever Indigenous Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Wonderful. This morning, actually, I was looking at one of the books around our great icon, Nelson Mandela, The Prison Letters of Nelson Mandela, and the foreword was written by his granddaughter, Zamaswazi Dlamini Mandela, who made the point in the foreword that Mandela always said never to forget your past and never to forget where you come from. So that kind of takes us into, you made reference to South Africa, growing up in South Africa. Can you take us back there for a moment and share with us, Prakash, is there a particular, you speak about coming from humble beginnings, was there a tipping point as a child growing up in South Africa? And is there a particular event that you remember well that you could share with us that had a really big impact on your life? What was it? How did you feel at the time? And how do you think that kind of shaped your decision to pursue this path and career in your life?
People can see I'm of Indian origin, third generation of Indian origin. And I was born on 16th Street, Vredendorp, popularly known as Fitas by those who lived there, in Johannesburg. And by the stroke of a pen, the Group Areas Act, that was marked now no longer an area where Indians, Coloreds, and some Africans had lived, we were kicked out. So I was very young at that stage. It was in the early 60s. And so my parents were kicked out, and everybody else was kicked out. Some had moved to Lenasia, south of the city, at about 30 kilometers out. My parents moved to Benoni, which is on the East Rand, 30 kilometers on the east. And so I thought there was something wrong, that already as a kid, that, we were living okay and we were just kicked out by the stroke of a pen. So it made an impact on me from a very young age. And
how did
we had
you feel at the time? I mean, how did you feel? How did the family respond?
I was a little confused, I was a little kid still, but I didn't understand, what was happening. And my parents always, I think most Indian families at that time anyway, always had a picture of Mahatma Gandhi in the house, know. So I knew he wasn't a relative, so I would ask, now, who's this guy? What's he doing here? And so, they would explain to me who he was and what he did and how he fought for the underprivileged and downtrodden and so forth. And as a kid, I think it was who probably said, yeah, one day, you can be like him, and but it never struck me, you're just a kid, right? You don't remember those things. But when I say humble beginnings, my family was fairly poor. None of them had an opportunity to have, even high school finished, matric. My father was very fortunate to be allocated a dairy depot where he became the milkman and would deliver milk door to door every morning. In those days, they used to deliver door-to-door milk in glass bottles, I might add. And so my dad would deliver very early in the mornings, and at 7 in the morning, he would go to his full-time job in a clothing factory. So from 7 to 7, he would be in his full-time job, come back, get some rest, and then early next morning. And when his business grew in terms of milk delivery, he had to start earlier and earlier with milk delivery, 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock, almost midnight, and then still go at 7 o'clock to his full-time job. All this because he was a very bright student, and so was my mom for that matter. But because of the apartheid laws at the time, they were not given an opportunity to be educated, and they had to support the family as well. And I also remember my grandparents on my mother's side. they had a trolley, a pushcart trolley with 2 wheels. They would fill the trolley with toiletries in the morning and push it to Braamfontein railway station and stand there the whole day selling their things to passing passengers.
Yeah.
And those passing passengers would mostly be Africans, so-called blacks here in North America, but also Indians and coloreds, because if you recall, we had separate entrances for railway stations, and we also had separate coaches for trains as well. So I knew that my parents sacrificed a lot, so I could become the first person in the family to be afforded an opportunity to go to university, and the first person in the community to become a lawyer. So that's what I meant. I come from humble beginnings. We didn't have much. We didn't have a car at the time. Just the bare necessities. And so thanks to the sacrifice of my ancestors, my grandparents and my parents, I was able to accomplish, a university degree and become a lawyer.
Yeah, and a very successful and prominent lawyer at that. Prakash, pausing for a moment, what is your definition of leadership?
That's a question that's I'm not sure I'm qualified to do. I've never studied leadership per se, but I'll tell you what I think my personal feelings are about. A leader ought to be, somebody who is sincere, honest. Honesty is the most important thing, and doing the right thing, irrespective of, what the popular sentiments may be. When I always think about Mandela, and when I think about him, I've never heard him talk about me, or I did this, or, it's never about him. It's always about we, and it's always about our and the country or the organization. And so, I think it is his character that was unrelenting. And leaders are prepared to sacrifice, which he did, and the dedication to the people. He literally was willing to give up his life, for the cause that he believed in. That's the extent of the sacrifice he was prepared to give. You remember the famous speech he gave when he was convicted in court, that he was prepared to die. And that's what I'm thinking about, right? And then, of course, he spent years and years, in jail. And there's other people as well. I think I just mentioned, Mahatma Gandhi. I think he was also prepared to die for his cause, He went on hunger strike, and he was prepared to die just to bring people together, So leadership can be many different things in my view, and these are just some of the things. Humility, I think, is a great thing that a leader need to have. I'm reminded of a quote. I'm busy reading, actually, coincidentally, a book on Lee Kuan Yew, the leader of Singapore, who transformed Singapore from poverty to one of the top 10 wealthiest countries in the world right now. And one of the things he said was, he says, he's very determined as a leader. If I decide that something is worth doing, then I'll put my heart and soul to it. The whole ground can be against me, but if I know it is right, I'll do it. That's the business of a leader, he says, And so to me, a leader is not what you say. It is more what you actually do by example, So in short, that's my understanding
of leadership. There's some very powerful points you make. If we think about where the world is today, what are the kind of 3 things that keep you awake and concerned about this current moment in world history?
Wow. I think leadership is one of them. The lack of good leadership globally. We seem to be straying so much further and further away these days from good leadership. But aside from that, I think one of the things for me, I think at the top of the list you would be the climate change and the climate challenges that we are facing.
Yeah.
I think for the longest time, there have been deniers, and we are seeing now the consequences of climate change worldwide, you know. So I think that is probably, you know, something at the top of my list. I think poverty as well. You know, there's so much of abundance in the world and so much of waste in the world. And yet we have people, you know, starving, and poverty. And racism, you know, has reared its ugly head. And so racism is an issue that needs to be tackled as well.
Yeah.
And of course, wars, you know, wars and the threat to world peace, you know, what's happening and what's potentially happening. And, you know, with nuclear weapons these days, with people threatening, you know, nuclear weapons, it could be catastrophic, you know. So I think those are some of the things that I think are challenging and needs all of our attention.
Yeah, those are all big issues. If we think about going back to peace and war, you know, having lived through a very turbulent time in South Africa, I would love you to take us back to your time, Prakash, in the mid-80s. That was a very challenging time for you. But if I think of September 1984, we had the Sharpeville riots, second lot of Sharpeville riots. You know, Sharpeville became famous in 1960, in March 1960. But in September 1984, again, we had the Sharpeville riots, the death of the deputy mayor, Mr. Dlamini, and you very famously defended 6 protesters who were prosecuted and sentenced to death, despite the judge acknowledging that there was no evidence that they had committed the crime. You were a young attorney.
But this was the first big murder case because there were 6 individuals. And it had a lot of political underpinnings. So yeah, I was young. I was 28 years old when I got the case.
Yes.
Yeah. The early to mid 80s was very difficult. You know, South Africans may know this, and maybe not all South Africans, but only whites had the right to vote, and they were the minority, less than 10% of the population. Anybody who was not white had no representation in parliament, had no vote, right? So in the early 80s, what they tried to do, the white South African government tried to do, is to co-opt coloreds, the mixed race, and Indians, not into parliament, into what they call the tricameral system of parliament. So what they did is they're going to build a second house and a third house. So coloreds and whites, coloreds would have their own house, Indians would have their own whites house, and the whites would always outvote, of course, coloreds and Indians. So we, in our communities, we campaigned actively against that. We were harassed by the police because this was a fraud on the people. There was no true, representation. And I'm glad to say that both the colored communities and the Indian communities popularly rejected this. I mean, over 90% of the population didn't participate in the sham elections. Africans, on the other hand, were completely excluded. They had their so-called reserves or homelands, right? South Africans claimed that, no, they don't belong to South Africa. They belong to their own tribal homeland. And they said they were so-called independent homelands.
White South Africans claimed.
The white South African government claimed. Not all white South Africans, but the white South African government claimed that these were 10 different homelands according to tribes, and they were not therefore part of South Africa, and therefore they were not, discriminating against this majority population. Of course, no country in the world recognized the independence of so-called homelands. Again, it was just a sham. So Black Local Affairs, the Black Local Affairs was the law regulating local municipalities in townships. And Sharpeville was one of the townships where only Africans could live. And just again, for the audience's benefit, because we take this for granted, as I alluded to earlier, the Group Areas Act that kicked us out and made it every racial group had to live in their own group areas. It was a criminal offense for an Indian to live in a white area and vice versa, for example. So it was a criminal offense. Right? So blacks had their own townships. Black local affairs, they had their own black councillors. Again, these were co-opted by the white government. They were not popularly elected by the residents of the local townships. They were not popular. And unfortunately, they were also put into a very precarious situation where they were prone to corruption because they had no real political power, because the political power really vested in the hands of the white municipalities. But they would allocate certain minor powers, like they would allocate homes for rental, for example, or business licenses. And so, you know, they were prone to corruption. And so they were not popular. They were considered sellouts by the community. And so on September the 3rd, 1984, there was a rent boycott, a rent protest, because these councillors who needed more revenue, and they, you remember, they don't have big businesses and industries where they could tax. So there's no revenue. The revenue was only the people. So they would hike up the rents every time. And people were poor and fed up with this, not getting services, not getting homes, and having to pay a lot, and them having nothing, basically. So people protested. And the one way that they protested, because they had no right to vote, remember, the one way they protested was to have what they call a stay away, a boycott. People would not go to work. People would not go to schools. Buses would not run, taxis would not run, and they would have massive rallies campaigning against unjust rent increases. And so this is what happened on September the 3rd, 1984 in Sharpeville. So the crowd was marching past towards their gathering place to the offices to protest, but en route to the office, they passed the home of Mr. Jacob Dlamini, who was the councillor and the deputy mayor of that area. And so some of this crowd spontaneously, and we talk about hundreds of people here, spontaneously stoned the house, broke windows. Mr. Dlamini was armed by the police to protect himself and his property. He shot into the crowd, shot a couple of people. The police arrived almost immediately. They dispersed the crowd with rubber bullets and tear gas. And they told Mr. Dlamini, it's not safe for you to be here. Better accompany us. Mr. Dlamini said, no, I'm staying my ground. This is my home. I'm going to protect myself and my family. And so he didn't stay. He didn't go with them. He stayed. About 15 minutes after the police had left, some of the crowd regrouped, attacked him, and brutally murdered him. It was a gruesome murder. This was on September 3rd, 1984. The actual perpetrators were never identified. They could never be therefore arrested. But what the police did after a couple of months, they arrested a whole bunch of people, tortured a whole bunch of people, got few names. Cut a long story short, few people, my clients, 6 of them, were charged with conspiracy and murder. Common purpose is the term they use. It's another word for conspiracy. Not that each one of them had killed, but they were part of this mob, and the mob was responsible for the murder. Now, there was never a case like this in South African legal history, where in a mob situation, you would find that you couldn't identify the actual perpetrators, but you said, well, because you were part of the mob, and because the mob had killed the deceased, we're going to hold you responsible for the actions of the mob. Because at the end of the trial, the judge did conclude, as you said in your introduction, not one of the 6 had actually caused the death of the victim. But here's the beauty part. The state, and the onus is on the state to prove its case beyond all reasonable doubt. They had no evidence of conspiracy, no evidence, right? So we were quite happy that the state had failed to prove its case. We should be found not guilty. But not only that, we were found guilty. Each one was sentenced to death. Now, that was what shocked the world, really, literally, where the trial judge concludes that not one of the 6 had actually committed the murder, and yet each one of them, and they were all in their 20s, all of them, they were not leaders. They had not conspired. There was no evidence. They were just ordinary people who got caught up in the events. And so this was going to be a terrible precedent. And so we fought it right through the end. The appeal court, unfortunately, We thought the appeal court will intervene. At that time, it was all white judges, not a single black judge, a white judge, only whites, no coloreds, no Indians. And incidentally, if my memory serves me well, I think there was about 180 judges. 179 were all male, white male, and I think there was one female white judge, right?
Yeah.
So that was a system of justice. And so P.W. Botha was a prime minister or president at the time. Prime minister, yeah. He, as head of state, has a prerogative to grant clemency and commute death sentences. He refused to do that. And his excuse was he doesn't interfere in the process of the courts, which was a big lie, because we had exhausted all our remedies in the courts, in the appeal court. In the same time he was telling us he doesn't interfere in the process of the courts, there were 6 South African Defence Force members who were charged with the murdering of a political activist in Namibia, of an activist. He personally intervened to stop that prosecution. I mean, that was now really political interference. The shock reverberated around the world.
Well, I think also the UN Security Council passed a resolution and said that this was a crime against humanity.
Yeah. So I think, I should mention something that happened when I realized that, these guys are going to hang. There's 5 young men and 1 young woman, and they're going to hang because, P.W. Botha was a very obstinate leader. If he decided on something that no matter what, I thought the only thing to do is to pile the political pressure because we had exhausted legal remedies.
Yeah. I did want to just contextualize this. So,
sure. Okay.
For you, Prakash, what was your big aha moment? Just very briefly, if you can tell us, how did you get to represent the 6? You've also published a wonderful book called the Sharpeville Six, the trial that shocked the world. How did you get onto the case, very briefly? And what was your tipping point that said, I really need to defend these people?
Yeah. In the mid-80s, early to mid-80s, there was a lot of political unrest and states of emergencies, as I said. Hundreds and hundreds of people were being detained. Their parents didn't know where they were. Their loved ones didn't know where they were. And so there was a wonderful organization formed by a wonderful man, Max Coleman was his name, and his wife, and also others who were co-founders. Amongst them was a guy called David Webster.
Yeah.
David Webster was an anthropology professor at Wits University, and he was part of the United Democratic Front, which I was part of. And so the Detainees Parents Support Committee would try and assist parents in locating where their loved ones were. And if and when they were brought to court, they would try and arrange a legal representation for them. Now, honestly, these types of cases didn't make us money. Most of them didn't have money. We were supported by some international organizations, but at a very low tariff in terms of the rates of fees. But we did it because we believed in defending people who needed the defense. And the other reason many lawyers didn't do this type of case is because you are up against the state and the police, and you become a target.
You were at risk.
Which happened to me. Yeah. So there were very few law firms that did this type of case. Our law firm was a small law firm. In fact, my senior partner represented the Mandela family. So we were a fairly high-profile firm. So, I think it was David Webster who brought the case to us. As young as I was the most senior litigator in the firm, believe it or not, But these poor buggers had nowhere else to go to, right? They couldn't hire the top-notch lawyers who would only want to be paid, right? So people often ask, how come you were so young, how come you landed up with this case? I said, well, they had no choice, But I'll tell you what happened, Anne. Over the 4 years that I defended them, they came to know and trust me, literally with their lives. I'll tell you an incident that happened that was a aha moment for me. after the appeal court, I come back to the office, dejected, of course, because I expected the appeal court to apply its own legal precedents in terms of sentencing, at least, never mind the conviction, because the sentencing of death is only meted out in the most extreme cases. In this one year, there was so much extenuating circumstances, mitigating circumstances. Not one of them had actually caused the death of the victim. That in itself was sufficient. But no, this 5 appeal court judges said no. And so I come back to the office and my senior partner said, Prakash, you've basically done everything you could for them. You did a great job, but not your fault. You can't do anything more for them. And I said, no, I can't leave them. I can't abandon them at this stage. Yeah, the legal process is over, but I can't just abandon them at this stage. And so we had a big argument. I mean, not an argument, it was a fight. And we had some other issues as well. And on the spur of the moment, I said, I cannot live with myself abandoning these people. I'm walking out of this partnership. I left the partnership. I walked out. And not knowing what's going to happen to me, the 6 were not my clients. The 6 were the clients of the firm. Right? So they were not my clients. I was not going with them anyway. And I was also somewhat disillusioned with the practice of law, knowing how unjust they were, perverting their own very laws and legal precedents. We thought we were going to use their own laws to fight them, right? And yet they were perverting their own laws. So I needed to expose that. I really needed to expose that. So I went home and I told my wife, I've just quit the firm. She was very supportive. She says, don't worry, we don't know where we're going to get our income from. She said, even if we have to live on tea and bread, don't worry, we will be fine, So I go to death row and I tell my clients, I'm sorry, I'm no more longer your lawyer because I've quit the firm. And they were shocked. I didn't want to tell them why, They were already in death row, for 3 years, over 3 years. And they said to me, Jan, and how can you abandon us now? You, the only one who fought for us and gave us so much hope when others had given up on us. How can you now really, at this stage, leave us? I said, you're not your lawyer. The firm is your lawyer, We're firing this firm and we're hiring you right now. And so that's what happened. And they pointed me right on the spot.
In your personal capacity.
Yeah. But I felt strongly that, I couldn't live with myself, doing what I was asked to do or not do what I was asked to do. So, anyway.
Yeah. If you can take us through, because I think where it goes from there is really very compelling in terms of how you took on a bigger system and leveraged the system, Prakash. Can you just briefly share with us what steps you took in leveraging other parts of the system, international media, international stakeholders, communities? What were the steps you took and what was the outcome?
Great question. And before I was about to start doing what I was going to do, I got arrested at court. And I was arrested in terms of the state of emergency. And I was kept in solitary confinement.
Hang on, I'm confused, sorry. Chronologically, where did that fit into you walking out of the firm and representing your clients?
Okay, so I was arrested just before I left the firm. Okay?
Yeah.
Before I left the firm. But their attempt, I think, was to dissuade me from continuing to do well for my clients. And so it was quite a harrowing experience. Never expected to be detained, kept in solitary. My wife didn't know where I was for 10 days. She went searching for me all over. And, people were being killed in custody. People were missing. It was a difficult time.
Yeah.
But when I exhausted the legal remedies, I thought we need a strategy here. And the only strategy I could think of is political pressure. So I said to myself, how do we pile this political pressure on P.W. Botha, knowing who he was? And I came to the conclusion that there are 3 people that he may listen to. And I targeted those 3 people. What I meant, there were Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time.
Yeah.
There was President Reagan, United States President at the time. And there was Chancellor Cole, of West Germany. All of them had great, trade deals, and all. They were opposed to sanctions, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu and many of us were propagating sanctions, and they were opposed to that. And of course, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who was part of the Commonwealth of Nations, and he had a running-in battle with Margaret Thatcher because she didn't want to impose any sanctions on South Africa.
Yeah.
And so what I did, I focused on them, those leaders, but many other leaders came on board. But those are the four leaders I focused on. And what I did was I prepared a memorandum, a very simple memorandum, laying out the case against each one of them, as the court had found, not my own editorials, just what the court decision found, and said, this is what the case is against Teresa Ramashomola, this is the case against Reed Mokoena, and so forth and so forth, and this is why they were sentenced to death, and this is the law, and how they have been dealt with in terms of the law. It was a really powerful. I tried to make it as simple as possible, not meant for lawyers, but meant for embassies and for journalists. And fortunately, I had a good relationship with embassies, because under the state of emergency, there was a lot of propaganda, censorship, and you name it. So they would never get information from the state, the South African white government. So they would keep in touch with lawyers like myself, who were working on the ground. And so we would brief them from time to time. So I had a good relationship with embassies, Nordic countries, European countries, all countries, actually. And the journalists
distributed this memo to all of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you, what was the crux of what you said in that memo that really got people's attention?
I think if you want to bring it down to that point, was the fact that the court said not one of them had killed the Dlamini, and yet they are sentenced to death.
Yeah.
The fact that they were sentenced to death for a crime that they didn't actually commit, according to the trial judge, just shocked everybody. To say their sense of justice was really shaken. So much so that Margaret Thatcher not only intervened personally, we got her to meet the mother of Teresa Ramashomola and the sister of Don Mokezi, Francis Don Mokezi. She had a personal audience with them. I was invited to the United Nations to testify at the General Assembly. I testified. They passed 2 resolutions. I had a wonderful woman in Washington, Gay McDougall. She was the lawyer, a civil rights lawyer for Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the Law. She had wonderful connections. So from New York, she took me to Washington and met with senators. Senators signed a petition. It was a big story globally. I didn't, in my wildest imagination, thought I would be so successful in galvanizing the world in this common cause.
And the
to put pressure.
Yeah, so it were leaders of these countries, of Western nations, embassies, the UN, senators in the United States.
There's one more I should add.
Yeah.
The European Economic Community, there was a EEC at that time, before the European Union. The EEC, it was being chaired by Germany at the time. And I had 2 wonderful people in the German embassy in Pretoria. And they put in a resolution in the EEC. And they threatened PW Botha, said, if this executions go ahead, we're going to have further sanctions, and we're going to deny South African aircrafts from landing into Europe. I mean, that's how far it went. And so here's the thing, Anne. Botha had already denied our petition for clemency. Okay.
Yeah.
And they were going to be executed on March the 18th, 1988. It's a Friday morning. They had 3 days notice they're going to be executed. And I tried to get a legal argument on the eve of them getting a stay of execution. And we succeeded literally hours before they were going to be executed. And that's when you see the picture of myself coming down the stairs from the courtroom where I was hoisted, and the crowd, hundreds of people outside the court, inside the court. And so after the stay of execution, we piled on the pressure, political pressure, even more. And so whereas Botha denied our petition for clemency, on the very same petition, we didn't amend it, we didn't submit another one. On the very petition, he capitulated and he granted clemency to the clients.
Changed, I mean, the sentence was changed to 18 to 20 years in prison.
Correct, 18 to 25 years. And even then, and I was not happy with that. And I was really, I was angry because at the same time he did that, there was a cop, there were 3 cops actually, and one cop in particular, I think his name, so one cop in particular, he had cold-bloodedly murdered an innocent youth, according to the words of the judge. He was sentenced to death. Both are community's death sentence and commuted to 6 years. Cold-bloodedly shot and killed a youth. 6 years. Ours was 18 to 25 years. So I was really angry. And so I wanted to document something. And, I was a lazy student. I was a lazy reader, a lazy writer. I confess to that. I just did barely enough to pass.
Up for that, Prakash. It's like you've been doing a lot of writing and developing since
catching up. But what I thought is I needed to document something. So I went to speak to Nadine Gordimer, whom I knew. And Nadine Gordimer said, absolutely.
Yeah, just contextualize her.
Oh, Nadine Gordimer is a famous South African writer. And she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1991.
Yeah.
And she was a wonderful woman. We had used her in one of our treason trials as a witness. Brave woman. I mean, absolutely brave woman to stand under oath and say, yes, she did support the ANC at that time, because that was she could have gone to jail right away.
Yeah.
But she encouraged me. Not only she encouraged me, she helped me put this book together. She put me in touch with the right people. She read my manuscript as well. So, I was very fortunate that, but because I felt the passion to write something to document this. And then what happens? About 18 months later, Nelson Mandela gets released, right?
Yeah, so February 11th, he comes out of prison, 1990. And in March 1990, you write a memo to Mr. Mandela.
Yes, I do.
So briefly, what is the essence of your message to Nelson Mandela, and what was the final outcome?
So, you may remember this. In the early 80s, he was offered a conditional release. And Mr. Mandela said, no, how can I be free when my people are not free? And I will not take any conditional release. So when he came out in 1991, February, as you say, he came out with no conditions, but except one, he said, all political prisoners must be released.
Yeah.
Right? That was one of the main things.
Yeah.
And so the government of South Africa at the time, under F.W. de Klerk, said, no, the Sharpeville Six are ordinary criminals. They're not political prisoners. And that was obviously wrong. It was a game that they were playing, I think. And so I wrote this memo to Mr. Mandela, setting out point by point exactly why each of the 6 was a political prisoner. And I won't go into the details of that, but this goes right into the parameters of the government gazette regulations that they said what a political prisoner was. They were convicted of murder as well as subversion, and subversion is a political offense. They were banned. They could not be quoted anywhere. Only political prisoners are banned and quoted. When they were arrested in terms of the Internal Security Act, Section 29, which can hold political prisoners up to six months and extended. Ordinary criminals have to be brought to court within 48 hours. Not so in our case. When I applied for bail, actually, for them, because they were in detention for months before they were actually brought to court, they were arrested and they were only brought to court, I believe, in April or May of 1985. I couldn't apply for bail because the Attorney General of the Transvaal, the old Gauteng province, it was the Attorney General of the Transvaal, he issued a certificate barring the magistrate from hearing a bail application. And that was only done in political cases, and there were many other instances I point out in 5-page memo to Mr. Mandela, so that he could be aware of the games that the government was still playing in terms of not wanting to release political prisoners. And the outcome of that was we finally succeeded.
And they were released during 1991 and 1992. What was it that you think Mr. Mandela did to help move those wheels along?
I don't know for certain, but I think Mr. Mandela was probably very firm on this because that was a condition of his release. From the early 80s, he was saying, how can I be free when my people are not free? Not only the mass people, but how can I, as a political prisoner, be free when other political prisoners are not free? And, that's true leadership, right? In its essence. I don't want to be free if my people can't be free, right? And so I think what he just pushed that and pushed that. And you know what? Nobody in their right mind, looking objectively at all of this, could come to the conclusion that they were not political prisoners. I mean, they were just playing a game.
Do you think he personally motivated for their release?
Oh, absolutely. No question. Because I was in touch with colleagues on the ground. And I have correspondence. I was, looking for this memo after we talked. And I found correspondences with my colleagues where he was going to be meeting the clerk. And I said, well, the timing is great. Here's the memo.
That's fantastic, Prakash. Just shifting gear a little.
Sure.
What is your Mandela moment? I know you met him. I know you've had so many moments that you could, but can you take us back to a specific time that really stood out in terms of how Mandela has shaped the way you think, act, and lead in the world today? When was that? What was that event?
For me, I think the biggest impact for me was when I met him. He said something to the effect that, good job, my boy, good job, well done. And that meant the world,
When was that?
This was in 1990, I believe. It was in 1990. He came to Toronto, Canada, and I knew his wife, Winnie, very well. So she pulled me aside, and then she took me to the room, and I was with him. I had defended her once in 1985, and she knew me very well. And so he just said, "Oh yeah, the Sharpeville case, I know it. Well done, my boy. Really well done." So that was I never talked about it actually. You're the first person who asked about it.
How did it make you feel?
Coming from Mandela, there was only one other person who had said that to me. And that was Mr. George Bizos. George Bizos was Mandela's, big-time lawyer. Oh, yeah. He was an icon in the legal field in South Africa. And he called me up immediately after we won the stay, and he said, Prakash, I'm really proud of you. Not many of us get the opportunity to save 6 lives at one time. He says, well done. Yeah. So I remember, but if Madiba says that to you, there's that's more than enough, right?
Where were you?
And I've never, sorry?
I'm so sorry. Where were you?
No, I was in Toronto with him, Winnie had a lot of time for me, I must say. She had a lot of time for me, and I had a lot of time for her, of course.
Yeah. So is there a particular event, apart from that very personal event, that stands out for you as being a moment that Mandela really shaped the way you think and exercise leadership?
Yeah, definitely. It's about courage and sacrifice to me, and I never thought about it in those terms, but just instinctively I was acting in that way. I never thought, but now reflecting upon it, when you ask me this, he was so brave. He was being offered a release in the early 80s. He said no, because I stand by my principles. And then he was so brave. For me, I don't even hold myself 1 inch of what the sacrifice he made, But he was also brave to stand in the court and say, you can kill me if you want to. You're not going to change what I think in my, what I'm telling you is the truth. I will live and die, for white domination and for black domination. But that's what he believed in. And because he didn't know at that moment in time whether the judge was going to sentence him to death.
Sure.
And the same for Kathrada, Ahmed Kathrada. I was reading about him as well.
Yes.
Similar. I mean, these were leaders of unbelievable character. In my own small way, I never gave up the fight for justice, despite many odds, the threats to me. I was tortured. They tried to frame me with treason charges as well. Fortunately, it didn't stick,
When was
while
that?
I was detained. While I was detained.
That was
1986.
1986.
Yeah. But fortunately, it didn't stick, But they tried to plant illegal arms and ammo in my flat while I was detained.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, but I mean, my sacrifice is nothing. One of my closest clients, a student leader by the name of Caiphus Nyoka. I said he was a student leader of the Congress of South African Students in the East Rand. I lived in Benoni. He lived in Benoni. I defended a lot of comrades in that area. And Caiphus was a wonderful young man. And when I successfully defended him, the cop said to him, "You and your coolie communist lawyer think you guys are smart. We're going to get you guys." And so when Caiphus told me...
That term was a very derogatory, demeaning term.
Yeah, very derogatory. Still is, But so I said to Caiphus, you know what, these cops are a little upset because I got you off. They wanted to put you away a few years in jail. Just lay low for a while,
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they carried out their threat. They shot Caiphus 11 times in his bed. They assassinated him, young man. And, so my sacrifice and bravery, if you call it, is nothing compared to so many, including David Webster, David Webster was a fine human being. And I was with him and my colleague, Azhar Kachalia, who was the national treasurer of the UDF, United Democratic Front at the time, my very good friend and colleague and partner at the time as well. And Azhar and I was with David 2 nights before David was assassinated. David was assassinated on the 1st of May, 1989, which is May Day.
His alleged crime?
Well, he was an activist. There was no crime. I mean, they had this this hit squad operating called a civic bureau or something. I can't even remember. CCB. They had a hit squad. I mean, his crime was, in my view, he was a white man fighting on our side of the struggle for freedom, for everyone. And that was his crime. And so it was difficult times, and so many others paid dearly, got messed up in detention as torture or exiled or indeed killed.
Prakash, I know you spent a month in solitary confinement. What did that time, how did you feel inside solitary confinement, and how do you think that experience shifted your approach to continuing the struggle?
It just made my resolve even stronger.
Yeah.
In a weird way. I mean, I was scared. Of course, I was scared. My belief was stronger in the fight for justice, and I was more scared for my family than for myself. When I was in detention, I was so concerned. I knew what was happening to me. I knew where I was.
Yeah.
I knew the conditions in which I was, but I had no clue of how they were coping with it. And at that time, when I was detained, I had an 18-month-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. So it wasn't easy for my wife either.
I mean, your family went through sacrifices as well, which kind of makes me think we have a really exciting new initiative with a feature film about the story of you and your family and your sacrifices in throughout your career and your journey. Tell us a little bit, what is the essence of the movie, and what does it mean to your family to have their story told?
Yeah, it's huge. As I said, I never thought I'd write a book one day, and then adapt into a movie. But the movie is based on our personal story. The book, I am just the narrator of the story of the six and their families. I don't tell my story. I don't tell my problems, my detention, and all of that stuff. It's not in the book because the focus was the six. But when the book got picked up, producers said, listen, we know your story. We need a central character. And they gave the example of Aaron Brockovich, for example, where, through your journey, you're going to tell a bigger story. Would you and your wife mind? My wife was with me. My wife's name is Manjula. Would you and Manjula mind if we told your story and the six becomes part of your story? And they said, one other thing. They said, we've never told a story of a South African Indian, a young man, young lawyer, and his family getting caught up into this whole apartheid system of justice or injustice, and you fighting for justice. I said, we don't mind if you told that story. That wasn't our intention at all, in doing the work or in writing the book. But if that's the way, you think it will work, absolutely. So it's just, it's a story about how an ordinary person like me get caught up into the circumstances and how one person can make a difference. But more importantly, how when we work together as a globe and get together and work with a common purpose, how much we can achieve and change, And so the working title of my movie may change, but the working title of the movie is called Common Purpose,
Common Purpose. I love it, Prakash, and I can't wait to see it in its final production. That's really awesome. A couple of quick fun facts. I miss South Africa because...
Oh, well, besides the family and friends, all the nice fruit and fresh fruit and veggies and the sunshine, especially in January and February. We're here in Ottawa in Canada. We have a lot of snow and cold. I miss home a lot.
I love Canada.
Oh, it's wonderful, peace of mind, easygoing. We have lots of problems, but we are tending to them, of racial problems with Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, people of color. But overall, I love Canada because it's given me literally my life. My life was threatened in South Africa, and the Canadians, I can't stop to thank them enough. They jumped into action. I didn't apply for asylum or anything of that sort. They found out about the danger I faced, and they put the wheels in motion to get me and my family out of South Africa within weeks. So,
that's remarkable. That's remarkable. I chose my wonderful wife as my life partner because she has which qualities?
She's so understanding. She's so forgiving. She's got unbelievable strength that I never knew she had. And she displayed all of that, especially during my detention. And truth be told, I wouldn't have been able to do all of the work that I've done without her full support. It would have been impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. And Prakash, we have a few final moments, but in those moments, I'd love you just to share, do you think Mandela's leadership and legacy are relevant in the world today? And if so, why?
I think they are even more so relevant today than ever before. I think principles are relevant and it's timeless. You can strategize and make things, but I think the principles are cast in stone almost. You can be practical, of course, and that's what I mean by strategy. You can be practical in seconds. But I think we need him more than ever because I find, and I'm obviously generalizing, that today we seem to see leaders who seem to be more concerned about votes and the party before the country and what's best for the country. They don't seem to, they seem to be afraid of doing the right thing, you know. Honesty and trust are the cornerstones of leadership, and you need to connect with people. And I think that's what Mandela did, you know.
Yeah.
He surrounded himself with good people, and now, you know, I think, you know, today there's so much of vitriol and personal and nasty attacks. And what he said is, it seems to become the norm and not really the exception, you know. So therefore, I think it is more needed now than ever before, you know.
Yeah.
Integrity, you know, humility that I talked about before. So, you know, I mean, that's my quick answer to you, that I think, yes, most definitely.
Any final thoughts you have about the future of leadership?
I think we need younger leadership with new ideas, fresh ideas. You know, I think, no, I'm not only talking about South Africa, but I think, you know, the environment is such a big issue. You know, it's an existential issue. I think we do need, you know, new blood, young blood. And I think, you know, that's what I would say.
Yes, yes. Well, Prakash, it's been such a joy. I'm so excited. And as Winston Churchill once famously said, in terms of our connection and working together, it's not the end or the beginning of the end, but rather the end of a whole new beginning. So I'm super excited about, you know, the work we're doing together. Bless you. Congratulations. And I can't wait to meet your wonderful wife and family too.
Yeah, I hope soon. Thank you so much. And I couldn't thank you more, you know, than saying thank you. But I want to wish you well as well, and all the best, you know, with all of your challenges that you're going through right now.
Well, thank you for your good wishes, Prakash. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Talking to my dear Canadian friend, Prakash Diar, the prominent and multi-award-winning human rights lawyer who took on the South African apartheid system in a trial that shocked the world, inspires us to get onto the balcony, correctly diagnose the problem, galvanize the system, and win. In the mid and late 1980s, Prakash defended the Sharpeville Six, who were wrongfully prosecuted and sentenced to death for a crime they did not commit. So often, when faced with a big challenge, like a legal issue, we diagnose it as technical, benign, and personal. I have personally experienced how we go to the courts. We think it is a simple matter between us and them, plaintiff and defendant. We present the facts, apply the law, and win, right? Wrong. Prakash lost the case in the courts. Truth be told, we have misdiagnosed the problem. What we think is technical, benign, and personal, more often is adaptive, conflictual, and systemic. We need to get onto the balcony, correctly diagnose the problem, and galvanize the system. Prakash pivots, innovates, and adapts. He took on the entire apartheid system. He applied global political pressure to galvanize the world to fight for a collective cause, because an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. He wrote a clearly understood memo, a hard-hitting memo, that used the court's self-incriminating judgment. He approached highly influential Western leaders, prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher, presidents like Ronald Reagan, senators, and embassies. He presented the case to the United Nations. When we design effective interventions to energize, mobilize, and galvanize the system, there are 7 critical steps. Number 1, get onto the balcony, collect and connect the dots. Number 2, assess the rightness of the issue. How good is the timing? Number 3, ask yourself, who am I in this picture? And number 4, think hard about how you frame the issue. Number 5, hold steady. It takes time for people to digest and own the idea. Number 6, analyze the different factions. And number 7, remember to put the issue and the work at the center. It is not personal. Ultimately, the Prime Minister of South Africa buckled under international pressure. The Sharpeville Six had their death sentence commuted, and shortly after Mandela's release, they were released too. You too can get onto that balcony, correctly diagnose the problem, galvanize the system, and win. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time, one step for you. But together, in a global community, when you galvanize a system, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.